Good morning, everyone. This is Casey Swegman from the Tahereh Justice Center. I'm the project manager of the Forced Marriage Initiative, and I am here with my colleagues Jeannie Smoot, the Senior Counsel for Policy and Strategy, and Dina Baki, who is the Forced Marriage Initiative Project Associate. This webinar is part of a quarterly series put on by the National Network to Prevent Forced Marriage at the Tahereh Justice Center. We want to thank all of you for joining us today, and a huge thanks to our panelists. The Tahereh Justice Center is a national nonprofit organization working to protect courageous women and girls fleeing violence through our direct services, public policy, and advocacy and training and education. Before we start the webinar and introduce our fabulous guest presenters, I just want to go over some housekeeping. We will be taking questions and comments from the audience during this presentation, and that way the way you can contribute questions is by using the question function on your GoToWebinar software. It is off to the right-hand side, and if you type questions into the chat box, we will be able to see those and then ask those to the presenters during the Q&A session. We will be monitoring that during the presentation and taking moments to pause and share those comments. So please do contribute to the conversation and share your thoughts and questions. We really do want this to be as interactive as possible, and they are excited to field your questions once the presentation portion is concluded. We will also be recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website, preventforcedmarriage.org, and it will become a part of our searchable resource library along with past webinars and training materials on forced marriage in the United States. And we encourage you to visit that website and look into the resource library if you're interested in learning more. I'm now happy to be welcoming our three guest presenters who are joining us today from the UK. So it's not the morning for them, it is the late afternoon. So first we have Anne-Marie Hutchinson, who is an internationally renowned family attorney and was a driver of the UK's Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act and has assisted in the protection of over 150 forced marriage cases. We also have with us Nazir Afzal, and as director of the UK's Crown Prosecution Service, Nazir was the most senior prosecutor in Britain and has prosecuted high-profile forced marriage cases. He is currently chief executive of the main regulatory body for police in the UK. And we also have Rashid Begum, who is a survivor of honor-based violence and attempted forced marriage, a former police officer, and is now a solicitor for the police in the UK. Rashid played a key role in a large-scale government inspection of police responses to forced marriage in the UK. So as you can see, we have a huge wealth of knowledge and expertise with us remotely today, and you can see them on webcams to the side of your screen. And as an audience member, you have the ability to make the webcam views larger or smaller as you wish. And I am now going to unmute our presenters and open the floor to Anne-Marie, who will get us started with her remarks.
Good morning, everybody there. Good afternoon to anybody here. I want to just say a few words about the UK experience of forced marriage and honour-based violence from a civil law and family law perspective, which is my area of expertise. And I suppose if you had to choose three words as to that area of the law, it is protective, preventative, and restorative. And I know that my two colleagues are much more experienced on the law enforcement and criminal law aspects of forced marriage protection, which is also hugely important. In the UK, we do have a specific civil law statute now, it's not that old, to protect and assist victims of forced marriage, or indeed prospective victims of forced marriage. And in very simple terms, that is an injunctive relief that allows the family court to make orders to prevent a forced marriage that may take place, to make orders to assist in preventing a forced marriage. So a court can order that a passport of a victim who may be taken out of the country should be deposited with the police or with the court. It could make orders for disclosure of any travel that there's a concern that may take place. And it can also make orders in respect of victims who are already overseas. Most commonly it will make an order that that person, be it a child or an adult, must be restored to the UK and must be put in communication with an embassy overseas in the country in which they are. And those in short form are what that Civil Protection Act does. That Act came after 10 years or so of a development in our common law using family law statutes and child protection statutes in a creative way to achieve what that statute now does to assist victims. And I'd said restorative because, and certainly Rashid will be dealing with this in a greater way, but we have to remember that victims of a forced marriage, clearly if a marriage has taken place, then they need to be put back in the position that they would have been in if that marriage had not taken place, which often means obtaining a decree of nullity and some other form of dissolution. But even if the marriage has been prevented, that isn't the end of their story. Just, they will have huge issues to deal with in moving on in their life. They may need ongoing protection. They may need to change their name. They may need ongoing injunctions against family members and the perpetrators. So, and they need assistance in moving on and being restored to a position of security and certainty. So that's what I wish to say initially about the position in the UK. I think we'll come on later to statistics in this area and how many cases. We're now in July, coming up for our busiest period, end of the school year, long summer holidays and the end of colleges. Graduation week really this week. This is the time where you see a lot of young people finding themselves facing a trip overseas that they do not want, or already being overseas and finding out that there has been a marriage arranged for them which they do not wish for.
Great. Thank you so much for those comments, Anne-Marie. And I think we will definitely have a lot of questions and comments towards the end. And for now, though, we're going to move on to Rashid and have her give her comments now.
Yeah, hello. I want to really touch upon the arguments for and against criminalization, and I think that's the things that Jean and I were talking about previously. Obviously, it is a specific offence in this country, and there were a lot of discussions about whether or not it should be, and a lot of issues in relation to whether that would force it underground. I was in favour of it for a number of reasons, because I thought that it is invaluable as part of a wider toolkit, including what Anne-Marie has spoken about, which is the civil protective orders. And although I firmly believe that it's not the only answer, I do believe that it's part of the answer, some of which was because it placed a duty, a very clear duty on statutory authorities and required them to take action, not only to protect but to put policies in place to do so. In terms of sort of criminalisation and those civil orders, the other issue is that, as Anne-Marie has pointed out, there were a number of issues in relation to orders that were made that they were effective, but the issues were whether or not they were being monitored or enforced, and by reference to that, a number of issues in relation to, I think there were about 800 issued between 2008 and 2015, and only 20 were prosecuted. And some of the sanctions awarded, one case had a £50 fine when it was civil. So as a result of that, obviously criminalisation came in. With regard to criminalisation, I would also highlight the fact that it has to go hand in hand with education. That means education of victims, potential victims, and empowerment, as well as encouraging discussion within agencies and communities and parents and professionals to ensure that they know what they're looking for and what the law says. And the third limb of that is if an effective response and investigation and enforcement and safeguarding. And that really is where the criminalisation of forced marriage in the UK led to the inspection in part, because there was always going to be a HVB inspection, that's an honour-based violence inspection by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabularies, which is a non-government associated organisation that reviews the effectiveness and efficiency of 43 police forces across England and Wales and how they operate. That organisation reviews them, inspects them and produces reports and recommendations to the Home Office to take on board. That inspection was the inspection that I was involved in last year, and obviously in terms of the outcomes that supported what we were looking at in terms of the fact that the responses to victims were inconsistent. There were a lot of good areas of good practice, but overall the findings said that the response to victims weren't good enough. And again, in terms of criminalisation, my view is that that now has placed forced marriage and HBA, so honour-based abuse, on a statutory footing, requiring not only the police but the local authorities, so in your case it would be government authorities, children's services, and sort of medical services and National Health Service here, on a statutory footing to require them to bring their practices up to speed. I'm not saying that it is the be-all and end-all and that it will cure everything, but it is part of the answer. I have noticed some changes and I'm happy to touch upon those, but some of the big changes are that the dialogue and the reports of certain parts of colleges where some research has recently been undertaken by Dr. Aisha Gill, where she said that obviously there's been a lot of people, a lot of the young people, male and female, have been highlighting the fact that they now are empowered to say that it's against the law and they are able to debate these issues. And in terms of police policy, obviously that's moved on, and just yesterday I was involved in another awareness raising event on the birthday of Shafina Ahmed. So there has been an impetus created by the offence and the inspection and the violence against women and girls strategy, where the recommendations have been fully incorporated as of the end of March. So in terms of that, in short, I think it has assisted in improving responses and hopefully will assist in improving responses further. However, we still do have a long way to go.
Thank you so much for your comments, Rashid. And I do see that we have a question. I think we're going to go ahead and let Nazir give his remarks, but I also encourage more people to submit questions in the question box on the right-hand side, and want to open the floor to Nazir at this time.
Tahiri, for inviting me to speak to you, your morning, my afternoon. As you said, I was Chief Prosecutor in the UK. Before, I was also National Lead across agencies for dealing with honour-based violence and forced marriage for a decade, and as you said also, I'm now responsible for police commissioners around the country ensuring that policing provides a better response, not just this issue but all issues. And what I want to share with you is really the journey, because you've just heard Anne-Marie talk about the journey in terms of civil protection. There's also the journey in terms of criminalisation. That's my area of expertise, and so I will touch on that really rather than civil. I'll leave Anne-Marie to deal with the civil aspects. In terms of the journey, it started about 12, 13 years ago when I first realized that this was an issue that had not gathered the kind of attention it needed across government, and it was necessary for that to happen. So we organized lots of awareness raising, educational events, and national conferences, which in itself are not enough. That's the awareness raising which has to happen in tandem with anything else that we choose to do. But it became obvious to us that the government response, the state response, was weak. It was fractured, as just been said by Rashid. It's zip code lottery as to wherever you are in the country, you get a different type of service. And so from our perspective, it was necessary firstly to understand the extent of the problem, and we did a sizable amount of research and police-led research really about 10 years ago to look at the extent of the problem, and we got some data which is really important to have, because data always informs a response. If you have the evidence, then you can take it further. So we did that. At that time, we realized there was as I think hinted at a moment ago, there was a consultation mainly among victims groups, NGOs, and the view back in 2006 was they were not in favor of criminalization by a majority. the view being that it would drive it underground at that time, and so the government, the UK government, decided not to proceed down the criminalisation route then. They supported the Civil Protection Bill, which you've heard about, and realised that that was, let's see if that works, and it had serious impact. But when we had a change of government here in the United Kingdom in 2010, the new government, which is the current government, decided that they would have a further consultation. So another consultation took place in 2011, and we then analysed the results, and by a majority now, a small majority nonetheless, the view was that there ought to be criminalisation. So we went down that route. We created the law in 2013, and we then waited 12 months really before the law became law. You know, there was a period of 12 months where it's been passed by Parliament but awaits commencement, during which there was a lot of work around guidelines for police officers and prosecutors, ensuring that there was serious awareness raising amongst the public, so that they knew that this was now a criminal offence, dealing with some of the queries people had, ensuring there were specialists, police officers, prosecutors, specialist trained judges, the NGOs were properly tasked, or I was going to say resourced, but that's a big issue in the United Kingdom in terms of resourcing, but nonetheless giving them some power and some ability to influence the way things were being developed. And we then proceeded down the criminalisation route, and almost immediately we had a successful prosecution for forced marriage, the first of its kind, which is quite significant because we criminalised FGM more than 30 years ago, actually, and in that time we've not had one successful prosecution in the United Kingdom for all sorts of reasons, which some I can share, others I don't know. And so the fact that we very quickly were able to prosecute somebody for forced marriage was a sign really that we were doing some things right. And there are lots of active investigations taking place around the country, so we anticipate many more prosecutions in the long run. The other things that I think I would like to touch on at this stage is that criminalisation is also about messaging. It's important to say to people that, you know, I think, Rashid, you mentioned the point that a child or a young person can say to their parents that it's immoral what you've done, it's against my religion what you're trying to do, it's unethical, but it gives them another tool in their box to be able to say, Mum and Dad, it's also against the law, it's criminal, and you might go to jail for it. And that negotiation, tool for your negotiations, shouldn't be underestimated. So, you know, again, Rashid said there's some research going on into that, the impact of that. That I think is another important plus when you go down the criminalisation route. But I think you've got to also recognise that, as has just been said, this is a long process. It's not going to take, just by criminalising it will not be the end of the matter. You've got to ensure that complacency doesn't set in. A lot of institutions, government and state institutions, think, well, we've criminalised it, there you go, we've done our job, and that's evidently not true. And so you've got to ensure that the educational side of things keeps going on, and be relentless. As Rashid made mention, yesterday in the United Kingdom there was the National Memorial Day for Victims of Honour Killings, which we only introduced last year, and that was an opportunity to talk about this subject freely and openly across the media and across communities. And so you've got to carry on and be relentless in the educational and awareness raising, because as I said, prosecution is actually a failure, because to prosecute somebody's been harmed. Is it not better to do some prevention work to stop it from happening in the first place? And that is about empowering the victim, empowering NGOs. It's about ensuring that we are all specialists and get better at what we do, and that we share good practice. And all of that is a continuing journey. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Nazir. Those were really insightful comments. And I think before we open the floor to questions from Tahir and questions from audience members, who I continue to encourage to put your questions in the question box, I would like to open it up to the three of you to respond to one another's comments. If you have things to add or responses to what you've heard each other say, we would love to open the floor to that.
Well, I entirely endorse what was said by both Rashid and Nazir, in that it's a multifaceted problem, and forced marriage, although when it occurs, probably there will be a period of time where there's an intensity around what is going on. But it is part of a long process within the family that can begin when the young person is very, very young, and can continue a long time after the forced marriage has taken place or has been prevented. So because of that, it needs a multifaceted response. And certainly my experience is that since the criminalisation, including creating an offence of breaching a civil order, making that a specific offence now, the activity and the proactivity of our various police forces up and down the country, in England and in Scotland, has been greatly improved, and the police response to these cases has been greatly improved. And indeed, this afternoon, I spoke with a police agency in respect of some civil protection orders they felt compelled to issue, but whilst at the same time being very aware that they were going to also commence a criminal investigation as to what had occurred to, you know, a family of 3 girls in teenage children.
I would echo that in terms of just say that in terms of the activity post-criminalisation, there has been a real sort of urgency with which to prepare and respond to the new offence. I think partially because it's given a definition and it's assisted in being able to identify what people are looking for. And that sounds silly, but it is relevant when you look at what we all deal with in the legal field. We all deal with tests. We all deal, you know, judges look for tests. So judges look for what you're considering. You know, Anne-Marie will probably be able to assist you more, but in the few civil protection orders that I've been involved in, you know, trying to explain and describe to a judge what this is and what that may mean can vary from judge to judge. And again, so that's got to assist in a lot of ways. The conference I was at yesterday was in the West Midlands, and which is part of the UK, and they basically identified that this year they've got 27 orders alone so far, and that has got to be a success. And I think the big key here is, what does success look like? Criminalisation is not just about prosecution. Criminalisation is about protection, it's about prevention, it's about empowerment, it's about saying, as Nazir said, let's stop it before it gets to that acute crisis point. And it's also about saying that in some cases where there are some families that no amount of education will do, that there is this final step that we need to go down. So I think it has helped galvanise that approach.
Great. Thank you all so much. Yeah, go ahead.
Amy, can I just say something?
Absolutely.
Can I just say something? Just to endorse what's been said about the long-term response. Too many judges that I know will say, well, she's safe now, i.e. this particular forced marriage has been prevented. And we know for a fact that we have bounty hunters in this country who are determined to find young women who've been, for example, rehoused. This requires a long-term response. Just because you've ticked a box and you've prevented one young girl from being forced into marriage, what about the other 2 members of the family, for example, who might be potentially forced to marriage in the future? And so you've got to have the resources in place to provide that long-term care, long-term support, and the awareness raising. I mentioned earlier on relentlessness. Mustn't underestimate that. You know, there are some judges who don't get it. Some police officers don't get it. I remember recently some police officer saying he had prevented a forced marriage from a woman from being forced into an arranged marriage, which, you know, total misunderstanding of what we're dealing with. There are 2 different things here. Arranged marriages, the royal family in this country have been through arranged marriages. So there's nothing wrong with arranged marriages when both parties fully informed consent. But again, there's a lack of understanding. We've got hundreds of thousands of police officers, and you have as well. You've got to make sure they all understand it. You've got to be relentless in your training and educational stuff, and you've got to remember, as Anne-Marie said, that the forced marriage itself is just like the earthquake. The earthquake is followed by a tsunami of domestic abuse, child protection issues, you name it, sexual offences. And so just because you've dealt with a forced marriage does not mean that you've dealt with the problem.
Great. Thank you so much. Those are really powerful and important insights. I really appreciate all of you, again, being here and being willing to open yourselves up to questions, which I think I'm going to actually hand it off to my colleague Jeannie first, because she's got a pressing question to ask.
Right. So, hi everyone. This is Jeannie Smoot, the Senior Policy Counsel here at the Tahrir Justice Center. And I'd like to ask the panelists, and probably particularly Anne-Marie, but I think both others can weigh in on this, about the interplay, even within one case. You touched on it a bit, between the civil options and the criminal avenues that could be pursued for that one victim. So, for example, Anne-Marie, can you speak to whether victims that you deal with who may seek forced marriage protection orders as a civil avenue first and foremost, what is their feeling about the possibility of criminal breach, if there's a breach, a criminal prosecution following that, or are they simultaneously at times willing to try that avenue first, but then to turn to criminal charges later? And in a related question to both of you, I know that some of the benefit, one benefit that's been cited of a civil protective order approach is that it provides a mechanism for a victim to take one step forward and basically send a warning, a clear warning to families that if they violate the order, certain consequences will follow, that they're kind of putting their families on notice that way. Have you seen the criminal law being used in the same way, that is to have law enforcement, police officers, victim witness advocates with the police, whomever, child protection authorities, actually come to families, warn them of the consequences for proceeding and deter them in that way rather than arrest them in that moment? Or, because that is an approach that it seems that some of the advocates here in the U.S. Or some law enforcement here in the U.S. has used with respect to times they've heard of planned female genital mutilation or cutting intended overseas. So I think it's just an interesting question for me. What is that interplay that you're now seeing? Are there fewer people willing to go for FMPOs because they fear further criminal complications, or more people willing to go for FMPOs, or about the same? I mean, is there any data points, are there any data points like that that you can point to?
Well, and the second question I'm definitely going to leave to my colleagues, because they would, I know that they would both have something to say about that. In respect of the numbers, in fact, there has been an increase year on year. There's an increase in the number of calls into the forced marriage unit, and I wanted to say that we do have a forced marriage unit, which is a joint Home Office, Foreign Office unit, specifically set up within our government, those two government departments. And as this is an international webinar, I think in addition to the law we've been talking about in practice, that it is essential that some such unit is created to coalesce all of these issues and to be a touchstone for potential victims. But their figures go up year on year, and the number of forced marriage civil protection orders that are sought increase each year. Now that may be because unfortunately we're failing in the education and there are more cases, or it may also be because more young people and more victims, or potential victims, feel safe to come forward and become aware that that this relief is out there and it's there to assist them. As to whether the interface between the two, many of these cases include, well, the majority of these cases start with protection, and the majority of young people will contact the police, or somebody will contact the police on their behalf. And in these cases, the police themselves will seek on behalf of that young person the protective order first. Now, at the same time, there may be a duty on them to investigate criminal offences that look, more likely than not to have occurred within that scenario. But the first priority is to protect the young person, locate them if it's one of those situations where they're missing, and ensure they're in a place of safety before moving on. So there is an interface, and certainly I've spoken to young people who, once they are protected, feel that they wouldn't wish to go on and support a prosecution of their family members. But it depends on case by case. And there I anticipate, but I know that my colleagues will answer this better, that there are certain situations where it would not be appropriate for there not to be a prosecution in some very serious cases. And certainly in a situation where a perpetrator has knowingly breached an order, knows it was prohibited, and nonetheless gone ahead and breached it, then I think that a prosecution has to proceed. What the sentence should be is a different issue, but certainly there should be a prosecution of breach of forced marriage civil protection orders.
Can I just endorse that? The gravity of the behaviour is what determines whether there's a prosecution or not. There may be lots of occasions, as Anne-Marie has pointed out, where what you have to do is the police have to carry out, and the agencies have to carry out a risk assessment, which means that you need to really understand the issue. You need to understand what the approach might be and should be in the circumstances. You need to talk to as many people who might have information that will support your decision making. But ultimately, if it is really grave, if the risk to that individual is really high, then at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what she or he may think about a prosecution. That decision is taken off their hands, and the prosecutor will make up their own judgment. And until we had the forced marriage criminalization legislation 3 years ago, we were prosecuting lots of these cases, but using other offences. I mean, there are assaults, there's blackmail, there's sexual offences. There are other offences available to you in the penal code, which you can use anyway in such circumstances. But one has to recognise that a risk assessment, and by that I don't mean a tick box. This is the thing that really grates me, actually, is that people think by ticking all the boxes they've carried out a risk assessment. Actually, it's about using your judgment. And there have been occasions when I was prosecuting, I can assure you, there have been occasions in which I've reached a judgment that, in fact, telling the parents to leave her alone is enough. And touch wood, not one of them has been harmed afterwards. But that's, I don't know if that's luck or because the judgment was correct. But the important thing is that the risk assessment has to be very thorough and to enable you to make that judgment. Because we were concerned, as Rashid said earlier on, about whether or not a lot of people would not want to come forward at all if they thought that their parents were at risk of criminal action. And of course, that would put them at greater risk if they chose not to seek any help. And so we gave the legislation, unusually for criminal legislation, does give the police the ability to go down the civil route first, rather than seek criminal sanctions, because that's the way to do it. That's the way to ensure that you have the buy-in and support of the victim before you go down that way. And whilst Anne-Marie mentioned the forced marriage unit, the other thing that we have here is the national hotline, which is now 24/7 as of yesterday. And so victims can ring up a phone number, a free phone number, any time of the day or night, seek support, seek guidance. This is run by NGOs, and the idea is that people can be guided at an early stage in confidence. And confidence is really important here, because I don't think we've touched on it yet. There were some serious concerns, and there continue to be serious concerns about the influence that certain families can have with the police, with prosecutors, because of solicitors, because they are engaged. And we've learned by mistake, I guess. We learned, for example, don't let a family member interpret on behalf of the person who is at risk, because how do you know what they're saying, and how do you know what pressures are being put upon them? We learned that. We've learned that you've got to lock down any information the police or any agency are holding, so that it's not inappropriately accessed by people on behalf of the family who are prepared to go to all lengths to get their child back or harm them. And one of the things we learned very early on is about mediation. My experience, I don't know if it's the experience of Anne-Marie and Rashida, is that families will say absolutely anything to encourage the authorities to give their child back to them. I'm fine. Don't worry, we'll never touch her. Look, you can put a tag on her, whatever, everything. They would say everything, and the authorities here fell for that on more than one occasion, and then that person was at greater risk by doing so. So mediation, mediation only works when we're talking about equal power. And when the family have all the power and the victim has little power, that's not mediation. So one has to recognize that again, that's learning through mistakes.
In terms of this, I think I totally agree with my colleagues, but I would go one step before that from a policing perspective and a victim perspective. And what I would say that is, as a survivor, as a victim, and the people that I deal with, when you look at them and they're coming to you, they are coming to you, these are complex issues. They're complex issues, they're emotive, there's challenges within them because you have been brought up for your whole life to comply with this code, to say that what they're saying is the right thing. And sometimes the very thing that you're feeling is to say, what am I asking for? Is this too much? And that continues for an awful long time. And one of the issues is that at that point you can't think straight. So when you contact the police need to be aware of these issues so as to enable them to undertake a risk assessment. And one of the things that I've said throughout, even with the inspection, is that if you don't understand the issues, you could have the best tick box, you could have the best risk assessment in the world, but it's going to be worthless. And when you go back to saying, is it enough to go and speak to the family? Is it enough to say that, you know, we're going to go down the civil route, or, you know, they're not going to touch them? As Naz has said, it has to be on a case-by-case basis. It has to be with regard to the risk that's posed, because essentially by allowing that to happen, and as the forced marriage unit provide such great advice as well here, we always say that that very action could be the risk that has just increased substantially for that victim. So that could be just the one chance you've got and you've just lost it. So at that point, I think the issue is yes, there's an interaction, but it all comes down to identifying it and knowing the risk that's posed and looking at the best avenue available, bearing in mind the needs of the victim, because you're going to get a variable victim as well. That victim is going to have differing life skills. If they've been to university, I was talking to somebody the other day who's been to university, she is more capable than somebody else who I was speaking to who hasn't done that. So their ability to cope and communicate is going to be different as well.
Great. Thank you all so much. I think we have a handful of really good questions from participants that I'd like to start giving to you all. And the first, I think, hits on something that we talk a lot about here at Tahere in terms of how can justice also be healing and restorative. And I think one of our attendees heard Anne-Marie say that you created the law in the UK to be preventative, protective, and restorative. And the question asks, could the panelists speak more about what the restorative measures that are taken, what are those restorative measures that are in place?
Well, I think, I mean, when I talked about restoring the victim, I've not really thought through what restorative work you could do with families. But that said, I do think that perhaps in cases where there may be, certainly not in cases where there's been physical violence and threats of physical violence, but where the family are genuinely willing to cooperate and where the victim is absolutely protected, that our courts could look at then ensuring that they attend specific courses, whether it's good parenting courses around issues of you know, a child's right to decide, the rights of teenagers, human rights, children's rights, etc. And I do think you can do some work along those lines, but not in place of protection or ensuring that a victim is safe. As to restoring the victim, I say, you know, it's long and it's hard, and the most difficult thing I find as a practitioner is, you may do something, you know, assist a young person at 16, 17, and you know, they contact me at 20, 21, and I say, oh, where are you now, what's happened? Oh, can I have my passport back? Oh, yeah, because I've been living at home for the last 2.5 years. Yes, I went back home because it was really hard. couldn't manage at college, couldn't get a job. And it's this, because if they're not able to live away safely from their family with life, life chances and can move on, I don't blame, that often. And the family, as Nazir said, have a huge investment in enticing them back home, because it's all about family honour and family. Once they get that young person back home, they can go into the community and say, oh, well, the problem's sorted, it's all resolved, and it was all a hiccup and all a misunderstanding. Look, she's back at home now, etc. So it's, ensuring that young person can live safely into the future.
Can I say that there's something about understanding the family's motivation, because there are lots of families that want to forcibly marry their child off because they think it's their God-given right. But there are many who are doing it in much more nuanced, complicated reasons. One of them is around disability. You have a disabled child, you think you're getting old, you want a carer for your child, and so forced marriage in those circumstances is for them seen as being a means of ensuring their child will be protected. Then you have those who are being pressured by the extended family. You were born, and your cousin, when a child was born, your cousin said, when she's 15 or 16, my son will have to marry you. And then they get to 15 or 16, everything has changed. I don't want you to marry, but they're being put under so much pressure, not just here, but maybe where they originally came from. And that, in those circumstances, I think restorative work might be useful, and again, it's something that we really haven't formulated as a strategy as such. But I think in those kinds of situations, you need to empower the family to be able to fight off the threats from outside to their child and to their families. And also in the case of the disabled child, there are other options in terms of care for your child that don't involve forced marriage. And again, it's about educating and supporting them in that process. So one needs to understand the motivation and of course, as I said, in many cases, it's straightforward. I will choose your partner. But in those other cases, there may be an opportunity for rehabilitation or a restorative work or some kind of support for the family which protects the child in those circumstances.
Don't you find, and I think Rashid, you probably, that often with teenagers, just around that age, and that's the most common age for forced marriage, 15 to 18, sometimes it's a reaction of the family because they have a teenager who's turned into a teenager, playing up, not complying, perhaps he's, behaving quite badly, may even get into some minor, problem with the police, shoplifting or, minor, drug use, and the family feel that this is their way to cope with that problem.
Absolutely.
And it's educating them out of that, as this is a remotely appropriate response to dealing with a difficult and troublesome young person.
I mean, Shafia Ahmed, whose 30th birthday was yesterday and was the reason why we have now got the National Memorial Day, she was exactly that type of person, 15, 16, wanted to make her own life, disrupted from as far as the family were concerned, and they ended up killing her. But the point is that you're absolutely right. In those circumstances, parenting skills might be a useful approach, which will enable both the child, the victim, to be protected, and for the family to move on.
I think what I would say is I think we need to be really careful about where you would look to explore those opportunities. I'm not disagreeing. Yes, there are some families that are perfectly open to it and that are fearful of those things, and that could be an option. But there are other families, for example, where sexuality is involved, and it's seen as something that is a cure, and that has been a situation. You're gay, this is going to cure you, and as a result of that, that's what they're going to do. And in that case, you end up having two victims. And I think, Nazir, you were involved. I think the CPS certainly in the last couple of years was involved in a very high-profile killing of such a case. And I think what has to be recognised is that even in those families, we could go wrong, because there has been numerous cases where, from the outside, you're looking at somebody who has got a lot of freedom, but it's a negotiated freedom. And that comes back down to the risk assessment. And it says, you know, you go through college, you go through university, then at this stage, this is what we expect of you. So there is some freedom, and for anybody else and the usual risk factors that would come about, you would think, oh, restorative, mediation, some sort of controlled input would assist here, but that was never going to assist. So whilst I don't disagree, and I think it is perhaps certainly even in sentencing, it's an option that needs to be looked at and considered and explored like we do for any other offender group, I think we need to be really careful about where it's applied.
Great. Thank you guys so much. We have a lot of really good questions coming in, and one I think would be really relevant to the current conversation and struggles that we have here in the U.S. And someone has asked, where does a minor go after either taking the civil or the criminal route? Do they tend to go back home, or are there shelters available for minors in the UK?
Well, there's the $6 million. You can see it's the $1 million question.
€1 million.
Depends on the definition of a minor. I mean, in the UK, a minor is under the age of 18, and that's the UN definition of a child. But certainly in the UK, 16 is the cut-off for our Children Act, and the children who tend to be most vulnerable are between 16 and 18, because if they haven't been in the child protection care process before then, the care process, because it's very expensive, is very reluctant to take them into the care process for those last 2 years, because it has ongoing commitments about up to the age of 24. So it's very, very difficult for a young person, and the answer is either they go into foster care, which usually will mean away from the area that they know, which will mean changing college, changing school, having their phone removed, being told they can't use their Facebook, all manner of other measures to protect themselves from being found. It's in foster care, and that is very, very difficult for these young people. Over 16 and 17, unfortunately, there are cases where the foster care isn't available to them. They have to go into hostels, young people's hostels, wholly inappropriate hostels for some young people who've, in all other ways, led a very sheltered lives. Sometimes they're mixed hostels, which cause particularly female victims, you know, upset. And in other cases, they're going to a women's refuge, where again, you know, they're with older women who perhaps fleeing a marriage, a violent marriage, and have young children. But again, not necessarily appropriate for that age group, 16 up to maybe 20, 21. So it's what Rashid is saying and what we're all saying. You can't just deal with a forced marriage unless you've got safety nets and plans and future resources to assist in, you know, restoration of these young people's lives. It's very difficult, and it's that point where the family tend to find them, and it's that point when they tend to give up and go and say to the police or to me as an attorney, you know, I've been thinking about it, and I really want to withdraw. I really think I'm going to go home. It was all an apparition. I just overblown it. I was feeling anxious at school. They got this whole scenario as to why it is that they underplay what's happened, and they just want to go home, because it's so difficult out there. And, you know, as I say, I don't blame some of these young people.
I mean, you can't underestimate social networks that you mentioned. You know, they might actually be happy to leave the home area, but they will not leave their Facebook friends and their Twitter followers, and of course, therefore, they'll be trackable. And that's what number one. Number two, I think you made the point about they come from often come from very tightly knit communities, and then you are taking them somewhere completely alien without any support. In one particular instance, I remember a few years ago, she was taken from London to the north of Scotland because they thought, in terms of geography, that was a really good place for her to be safe. She knew, well, she couldn't understand what they were saying, for starters, because English was a very Scottish accent.
Scottish people.
Exactly. And number two, she didn't like the food. She would prefer to go back home with all the threats that she had been facing and that she was continuing to face, rather than live in safety in an environment where we, the state, thought that she would be safer. And the other side of things, which you haven't touched on at all, is, I don't know if it's true anymore, but we don't have any refuges for men. And male victims of honor-based violence and forced marriage. So to this date, we still don't have anywhere for men to go, and I don't know if that's changed, but one of the things, obviously, that we've had to deal with in the United Kingdom is this issue of austerity and economic cutbacks over the last few years. And so there's even less money for the NGO sector and less money for social care and child protection, and that will undoubtedly have an impact on what's available for those who you think need to be kept secure.
And again, yes, I agree entirely with those comments. And in terms of what we call, I think you call them children's services strictly, we call them social care here in terms of under 18s. What will inevitably happen is if they are under certainly 18, well certainly 16 as Anne-Marie is saying, then there are procedures such as the safeguarding procedures that are well embedded that will kick in. The problem is they are based on the traditional social work approach, which is mediation, and again it comes down to training and knowing that that isn't always appropriate. When that happens, of course, you're then looking at an appropriate placement for someone who's gone through a trauma, who may not even know the extent to which they are a victim at that point, or understand the dangers that they face. I had a case where it was a girl who wanted the freedom, she got the freedom, but she was placing herself in more danger. And that's where it opens up to things like child sexual exploitation as well. So you've got to be really careful about how you manage the long-term care and the packages in place. And one of the issues is mental health inputs and being able to provide that support. And in terms of Nazi's point about isolation, as a victim and a survivor, the isolation is what really impacts you. And I don't, you can pass a law, but if you don't have an understanding and the support packages around you to be able to deliver some sort of ability to try and assist in that, in enhancing and creating life skills within those individuals, because they're very vulnerable victims, then you're going to lose them, and that's going to be lost to the CPS as well, and going forward in any of those cases, because that's what the draw will be. The draw will be going back to what you know, going back to the fact that they're your parents and your family, and the feeling that you can't do without them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we see a lot of the same dynamics here, where you can have a great justice system response available to someone, but if those social services and those other safety nets and support networks aren't there, they are left with some very stark choices as to where to go and things like that. So thank you for your honesty and for those reflections. I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We've got a question from Vidya Sri, who is on participating now and is herself an advocate and working at Harvard, and she would like to know a little bit more, if we could take it back, a bit about the consultation process that took place which led up to the decision. Nazir, I think you said it was marginal, but it did come out in favor of criminalizing. Who specifically was involved and what stakeholders were consulted in that process?
Okay. Sometimes you consult to get the results you want. So back in 2006, the consultation was very much open, i.e. A period of time where the government simply asked anybody and everybody to, what do you think? And I think it was something like 60% of people who made their views clear came down to the view that criminalization at that time was inappropriate for the reasons that we've already touched on about preventing people from coming forward, etc. But in 2010, the government that we now have actually had the criminalization of forced marriage in their manifesto, which is what they campaigned upon amongst many other things. And so when I met with our Home Secretary, who's now our Prime Minister actually, as of yesterday, when I met with her back in 2010/11, she made it very clear what the end result should be, i.e. we will go down the criminalization route, but of course we need to consult. And so a consultation, again, of a similar nature, asking anybody and everybody to come forward, did. What was interesting was that they didn't simply look at all the consultees everybody that corresponded with the government and say, well, what's the percentage in favour, what's the percentage against? What they found was that the vast majority of NGOs were still against criminalization. But the majority, or a substantial number of ordinary members of the public that had joined in the consultation were in favor of criminalization. So on a very unscientific numbers basis, there was now a majority in favor. So the majority of the people who work with victims were still against criminalization. Rashid, you may not know this. They were still against criminalization, but a majority of the those who submitted their responses were in favor of it. So the government were able to say at the time, oh, okay, the majority are now in favor of criminalization. So the result that the government wanted was the result the government got. And one needs to be one politically astute to realize when I met with the Home Secretary then, after the consultation had closed, that I knew what she wanted, and that our job was to just make sure the government were able to deliver what they had said they would deliver. So the consultation was relatively straightforward. It's the analysis that's quite important, and as I said to you, we had a political imperative, namely the government of this day wanted criminalization.
I'd just like really, well, I wasn't aware of that, but I think we have criminalisation, and I think, as Naz said, that the important thing is now is the analysis. And I don't know what current research is underway, but certainly at the time of criminalisation, my view was that the civil protection orders had hardly had time to bed down and enter through the system sufficiently for we to judge their effectiveness. And now we have criminalisation, so I think we do need to have some analysis of the two provisions and their interaction. Around about now would be about 5 years into civil protection, over 5 years, about now or next year, to see what the impact has been. Because without that, we're not going to be really going to judge moving forward what's the best way with implementation. But it will depend on I mean, the US, you have I assume would have to deal with this on a state by state, or could you do it on a federal basis, as it's such a big issue?
That's a considerable question that is pending with respect to all of the kinds of legal responses, including child protection responses that differ state by state, and even in some instances protocol-wise county by county or other smaller jurisdictions. So I suppose one of the things that you're starting to touch on now that I want to make sure to hear from you all before we close, and I think we have maybe one more question we can field just after this one. You've spoken, all of you, to some extent about a criminal response being an important part of a total package in a toolkit, right? But even if so, are there things looking back about the decision to criminalize, the timing, the sequencing, the rollout, the content, the scope, the penalties, the whatever, with respect to the law as it materialized in the UK, that you would change? As you may know and note from all of our questions about the UK's responses to this issue, the US's only advantage in coming from behind is that perhaps we can have more strategic vision looking forward on the basis of your hindsight. So if you can share with us any such reflections that you've had in the last few years about what you might have done differently, even if, as you've shared with us today, you believe that a criminal response is an important part of the options for the protection of victims.
I think for me...
For my part, oh, forgive me.
Yeah.
Oh, for my part, we are where we are. I don't think, I mean, Anne-Marie's point is very, very clear. We now have criminalization. There's no going back. It is effective. It's working. How effective and how well it's working, that's something that Anne-Marie quite rightly pointed out. We haven't had an evaluation. We need to evaluate both the civil orders and the criminalization in a year or two to work out whether or not what impact it's had. I think that we deliberately, it was one of the things we persuaded the UK government to do was to deliberately delay the commencement of legislation. So it was passed by Parliament and then wait 12 months before it becomes a criminal law, so to speak, because that 12 months enabled us to train, make people aware, educate the communities as well, media strategies, all of that stuff. And I think that's really helpful, actually. It was what we were able to negotiate from the government at the time. I think that you need a period where that happens. You can't simply criminalize and the next day start arresting people or start dealing with it as a criminal offence. That just doesn't happen. People need to have confidence in the law, need to understand it's criminal for starters. And I think that's really good, a bit of learning from our perspective. I think the other thing is that, and again, I agree with Anne-Marie here, I think the period between the civil protection order and the criminalisation needed to be a bit longer, really, for us to have carried on the awareness raising and carry on the educating. But as I said, we are where we are. So I wouldn't change. There's no opportunity now to change it. We're making the best of where we are in terms of having both bits of legislation available to us.
For me, I agree in terms of the delay and training. I think we could have done with more training into having looked at the inspection and seeing where police forces are, and they are quite advanced compared to other statutory authorities such as children's services and medical services. I think Anne-Marie will be able to help you in terms of what her experience is, but my experience is that local authorities, as in children's services in your case, and sort of medical services and all of those things are now catching up, and maybe some more input at that point would have been a better option, just to try and get everybody to a particular level so that they could identify it. The other thing is that in terms of understanding, and we obviously the forced marriage unit had provided statutory guidance in terms of FGM and other matters that sort of interact with forced marriage sometimes. That wasn't statutory, so we needed a more joined up approach in relation to a more defined and clear strategy document for those where they interact with each other, and for investigation certainly as well, there needed to be sort of what we have here, and I think you've got an equivalent, but I'm not quite sure what it is, which is the College of Policing for investigation purposes and all of those. I think they're currently now reviewing our risk assessment tools, and I think that would have been more of an advantage had it happened beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to endorse both of what's been said. I mean, I think we have to remind ourselves that, and as Rashida said earlier, it's very unusual. A young person won't go into a police station or speak to social services and say, oh, I am the victim, I think, of a potential forced marriage. What they will present is perhaps a package of behaviours that are going on in their household or towards them, but they will very rarely identify it for what it is. And I think we've all sat there and actually said, listen, this is what's happening in your life. You've explained, restrictions on your going out, on your going to college, probably, what's going to happen about your cousin in the far distant future, and this is actually what it's called. So training around those issues, I think, is really important. But the other thing we have to remind ourselves is how are we going to gauge effectiveness? Because, for example, if the number of prosecutions goes up in a year's time or goes down in a year's time, that of itself is not a gauge of effectiveness, because it may be that the perpetrators are finding different ways around the issue, that their young children are being sent overseas at a much younger age before the issue of a marriage perhaps hasn't even arisen. And I have heard of practices where children as young as 10 are being sent overseas to be educated to higher education level, so that nobody in this country can interfere with any arrangements for marriages for those that will be arranged at the family's appropriate time. So we need to be aware that for every prosecution there's a defendant, and families, unless the education is working, are not going, if they're not giving up the practice, we have to be very highly attuned to what are they doing to avoid the initiatives that have been put in place.
Great. Thank you guys very much. I think I have one more question from an audience member, and it takes us back a little bit to a mention that was made to the FMU and to individuals who are from the UK but find themselves overseas being threatened with a forced marriage. And I think here in the US we struggle with that quite a bit, and how to serve those individuals. And there was an interest in how effective those orders to bring someone back have been, how do they work, how creative do you have to be, and on the ground overseas, how effective has it been for them to go in and actually rescue and repatriate people, and how does that work?
Okay, well, I mean, it will depend again. It will depend on the country, and you know, we've all acted in cases ranging from the Sudan, Eritrea, through to Pakistan, Bangladesh. So it will depend on the country. Certainly, relationships with countries such as India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, those are for the UK, Commonwealth countries, and we share a common law heritage. So that's made it from a civil perspective more easy to have some recognition. But certainly the FMU and my colleagues will support this. It is an amalgamation. It's not just the civil law, and there's cooperation between law enforcement overseas, law enforcement from this jurisdiction, so I'll let them comment on that. And very, very attuned training of consular service officers overseas. And I know that the Foreign and Commonwealth officers ensure that their forced marriage personnel who deal with these cases overseas receive intensive training that is year on year, because of the seriousness of these cases, where there are situations where they will go out into the community overseas and rescue a young person. There are other situations where it's not possible for them to do that. And again, then it will depend as well on whether the victim is a national or whether it's a British national, or if it's a non-British national, there may be a limit as to what our government can do.
Yeah, just on that point, we recognised a long time ago that you need an international response to this. It's not whatever you do locally is not going to have. Will have some impact, but it will, given the point that you just made, Anne-Marie, that people will find a way around this by taking their child abroad earlier, for example, realizes that you've got to have an international response. And we've been very keen. We're very fortunate, I guess, we did have a British Empire, and therefore the Commonwealth links are actually very strong. And so a lot of the countries where victims are taken, we've been working very closely with the jurisdictions there to ensure that. But it's important that you send out a message. We've been very keen on this for the last decade or more, telling other jurisdictions this is really important to us as a state, that you support us on this. And by saying that, then they will take it a little bit more seriously. But we've got to have strategies in place. So we've trained consular officials very, very detailed. We've spent a lot of our international development money also locally to try and support, for example, in Somalia, we've been working with Women's Lawyers Association over there. The British government funds the Somalian Women's Lawyers Association in order so that they can provide support to Somalian women, which is really important for us, but obviously important for the Somalian people. And so we've done a fair amount of developmental work at the house. We've done a lot of consular training. You've got to recognize some of the challenges. If a young woman or man is sent abroad to, say, Bangladesh, you can't say that they're living at number 45 Greengrass Avenue, Florida. They will live in the little house by the big tree underneath the smallest mountain near the hill. And so we have different challenges in terms of locating the individual, but our consular officers make sure that they do what they can, working closely with not just the consular officials, but with the locals in those countries. And I've had a lot of approaches, I'm sure you have too, Anne-Marie, from American law enforcement and others, saying that we need some help in Qatar, we need some help in UAE, we need some help in Somalia, whatever it is, and we're prepared to offer our support on those occasions involving American citizens. So this is a need for international response, which also, as I think it's just been alluded to, strong policing links. So the British police have spent many, many years cultivating strong links in other jurisdictions. We do a lot of training, British police do a lot of training in India, Pakistan, the UAE, Middle East, North Africa, in order not just to upskill them on some basic policing techniques, but also on the kinds of things that we're touching on today. So it's about relationship building, to put it bluntly, and that will enable you then to provide a better service for any type of criminality or any type of victim.
From my perspective, yeah, again, totally agree with them. And I think the other side of it is to bring it to the global stage. And I think that happened with the fact that child and early forced marriage was put on the agenda at the UN, and the Girls' Summit brought it into an international forum. So I think those type of things and the pledges at those events assisted in, at least publicly, raising the issue internationally, creating those links between politicians and the political sphere. Then in terms of a more sort of practical and strategic basis, obviously the leads within this country for policing and CPS as NASWAS, and looking at that and having those links. But it is to say that the Forced Marriage Unit have done a huge amount of work in terms of repatriation at that point, in various countries, and I know Anne-Marie will sort of agree with me. They have created links with NGOs. Say, for example, to my knowledge, the instant ones that come to mind are in Pakistan, in the remote villages, where you can, where they are able to try and negotiate repatriations. But even in those cases, some areas are simply too dangerous to go. And so from that, it comes back to your risk assessments. If you have people that are likely to be at threat of that, it's what advice you can give them and what steps you can take to make sure practically they either don't go and don't travel, or place them in the best possible position so that they are they are able to access those protections. For example, travelling on British passports and various other practical steps. So I suppose that's that's a political response and a strategic response from this country, and certain levels way above me and NAS level in terms of creating those relationships for policing and prosecutors, and then on a more practical level for sort of day-to-day policing in terms of advice and assistance, and having the awareness for those officers to know how to advise those victims and potential victims about where they're going to end up.
So this is Jeannie again. I have another question to pose around the relationship of the different bodies of law to each other, and specifically your civil laws, your criminal laws, with your country's immigration laws. Could a charge of forced marriage, a conviction for forced marriage, or of breaching a forced marriage protection order lead to someone with some status less than UK citizen being deportable? In this country we have a tremendous entanglement between our laws, our civil and criminal laws in other respects, and our immigration laws, such that certain criminal charges, certain breaches of domestic violence protection orders, for example, can lead to deportability. They can also lead to bars to being eligible for asylum or refugee status if that sort of thing is pending. So if you could speak to whether that's an issue you do have in the UK, or an issue that you haven't had to address in the UK with any of these legal steps you've taken.
Well, I'm going to answer this, but I'm going to leave that issue about cancellation of any immigration rights to law enforcement specialists here. But the issue of immigration status is relevant to the issue of forced marriage and HPV, because there is a spouse, be it a female spouse or a male spouse, and in the majority of these cases, the spouse comes from overseas. The young person travels from this country to be married overseas. They come back, and it is inevitable that they must make some immigration application in order for their spouse to join them. Now, there is a lot of work being done around what we call reluctant sponsors, and there's a number of young people. And again, I think there should be some research, because this, as Rashida said earlier, it's a negotiation. possibly before the change in the laws, a lot of young people dealt with this situation in their family by negotiating. Okay, if you let me go through college and get my degree, I will then marry. Or I'll marry and let me finish my degree, and then I will bring my husband in when I get, when I'm in a position to earn money. And they've negotiated that deal in the hope that somehow it will all go away. And certainly in that situation, if they come forward and inform the immigration authorities, there is a means to make sure their spouse is not actually allowed to be sponsored into the country and come in. As to after that an offence, our notion is that all immigration status is discretionary unless you have a citizen.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, it's very common for deportation orders to be made, but what the court can only recommend. So a judge sentencing an individual who may have not the kind of status you just mentioned could recommend deportation at the conclusion of their sentence, or sometimes instead of, i.e. a very short sentence, but to send them home. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they will be deported. That becomes a matter then for the State Department to make a judgment on. But yeah, there's nothing stopping that happening. So I think from your perspective, yes, what you have is very similar to what we have. The judges can make a recommendation for deportation, and the State Department will then make it happen as and when they've served their time in prison. So I think there isn't any major difference. But I think I want to endorse what Anne-Marie said about when you have a situation where individuals are bringing their partner over, that is actually much more common. And then the immigration issues that arise from that. The government here have been trying to grapple with that, with an age restriction on being able to marry, and a certain income you have to have before you can bring your spouse over. And then we've tried to introduce, at the same time, we've introduced some confidentiality. So we'll take her aside. Is this really a proper marriage? You'll tell us. So there are lots of things you can do, should do, as part of the strategy here.
I don't have much more to add in terms of that, other than to say there is the other side of that, where somebody is brought over and their status isn't sort of legitimised while here, and then their spouse leaves them. There are other issues so far as that's concerned as well. So you end up in a position where, again, the complexities arise. And yes, we have tried, I think, as Anne-Marie's referred to, there is sort of domestic violence, and where you've got sort of trafficking issues, or where you can apply for some discretionary leave to remain to make some decisions, but that creates a lot of uncertainty for certainly victims, or where there may be children. So it's not a one-size-fits-all response, I think, is the basic message from this particular sort of area.
I'd like to endorse that I think, and there have been, and many European states have looked at it, immigration responses to forced marriage. They are part of the package of responses, and they must be looked at. They can't be the only response. And I think it's in situations where it's been seen, if you put the age up to 24 before you can bring a spouse, and it will solve everything. Well, it doesn't. And the other side of it is, if the practice is still going on, then there is another way around it. Now, it may be then that these young people will be sent overseas. If we can't bring your spouse in, you must go and live there to join him. Now, is that young person in a better position if that occurs or not? I mean, one might say, well, at least if they're in the UK, there are other protections, we can assist them, rather than once they're overseas, there's very little we can do. So it's nuanced and it's difficult, the immigration. You have to look at both sides, and as Rashida said as well, lots of female spouses come into the UK to join British husbands every year, and we can't bring in regulations that by the back door have an adverse effect on them and their human rights and what happens to them.
So there are a few questions, a few comments that you've made that have raised, have repeated this concern around what services and supports are available to victims. What are the ways in which they can be encouraged forward and supported as they make decisions that are very difficult with respect to their families and what their lives ahead will look like. And I'm wondering if you can comment. I've heard actually from some of our UK NGO colleagues that there's considerable attention paid to research and to the kind of outreach on forced marriage that reaches through trainings and through sort of here are the rights, here are the laws, service providers and other sorts of statutory agencies, but less so with respect to actual services and support, shelters, legal and social services supports. And you've mentioned several times the imperative, the kind of equal imperative, but I haven't heard how it's being tended around changing the social norms, changing the underlying social norms, and sort of not necessarily, we have this expression, preaching to the choir or preaching to the converted, but instead addressing those elements that are actually less resistant to the message of, you know, this isn't something that could be done. So I wonder if you could address that, sort of what kind of attention is being paid to those other pieces, the services and supports and the changing social norms, and at the same time I do want to know whether there were certain concrete supports that are available to forced marriage victims now that perhaps weren't before. I'm mindful in the U.S. that some, for example, we have these state crime victim compensation funds to which someone can apply if they've been a victim of a crime. It's small money, but it may be considerable for a particular individual at a critical juncture. But are there any sort of concrete elements like that that did kind of open up to you to advise victims that they could access in the era post-criminalization?
Well, there's a number of questions there.
That would have been a terrible
service providing and training, and that's ongoing. And Rashida mentioned the best practice guides for social services. And I can't just emphasize, it's just got to happen. It's got to be ongoing, because otherwise victims won't come forward and they won't be able to live safely away. As to criminal compensation, I hadn't really thought about that, but there's no reason, it seems to me, why they shouldn't. But I certainly represent a number of these. They're my clients, these young victims. And I have looked at that, and I have looked at them. Do you wish me to make an application, for example, for college fees against your parents, so that your parents should assist you, or for maintenance if they're young enough and they're still in full-time education? And invariably that young person say no, because if they're living away, they don't want any more. It's the ongoing connection. So whether we can do compensatory issues or not is one thing, but I think that can be looked at, but you've got to look at what the buy-in for the young person is. Rashida, what do you think about that idea of looking to the perpetrators?
I think it would be difficult. I mean, from my perspective, most of the victims that I deal with, and granted, I will say the people that I see or are passed to me, one of the services that I do sort of voluntarily is speaking to victims who are in a crisis situation, who are at that point. Me personally, when I was in that position, one of the things I did was I walked out with nothing, and one of the reasons was if they didn't know where I was and they had no call over me, then that was a protection for me. The other part of it is that's one of the things that it's not something that will be, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the time it's not something they think about, nor is it something that comes to their mind at that stage, because there's such fear, there's so many other feelings of guilt, shame involved at that stage, that's not something that, whether we should ask for it, well, that's a different matter. I don't think they would personally want that at that stage, because again, it does show a connection, and whether or, how that would practically work, well, you would then have the ability, they should have the ability to challenge it, and that's going to be putting them through something more, isn't it?
I'm sorry, this is Jeannie again. I just should clarify, and I apologize. I would make a terrible litigator. I make such incredibly intricately compound questions. But my point was that the kind of funds that I was referencing that are available to crime victims in the U.S. are not sought directly from perpetrators. They are sought, you make application to a pooled fund at the state level. And what you must show, though, is that you are a victim of certain enumerated crimes, and the monies can be applied to certain purposes, and you have to have reported the crime to the police in most instances, or those sorts of things. There has to be some evidence that, in fact, yeah.
We have that. We call it criminal injuries compensation. So there is a pot of money, a very small pot of money, with very strict restrictions about who can apply and in what circumstances. But that is available. But again, as I was saying, I don't think it's the priority for the victim. She wants, or he wants, a clean break, and and she doesn't want anything that connects her with the court. One of the things we're bringing in this year is anonymity for victims of forced marriage prosecution. So during the sex offense victims automatically get lifelong anonymity, and forced marriage victims will get lifelong anonymity during after a criminal case. So they don't want anything to do with the case. They want to be safe. They want to be away from any potential risk of harm. But as I said, there is a pot of money they can seek. I think one thing I wanted to touch on, we've got the forced marriage unit, we've got the national hotline, we've got guidelines for everybody. Everybody knows this issue should do. We've got significant communication strategies and media strategies. But as Rashida said right at the outset, there is some complacency sometimes that we've done everything and that we've got everything in place when in fact we haven't. And we're still on a journey ourselves. So I don't think that we could possibly turn around and say to you, we've got all the answers here. And when you mentioned earlier on about the state sector, i.e. all the state services should know what they're doing. Well, they should, but they don't. Similarly, you mentioned preaching to the choir. Very often, I don't know what your experience was yesterday, Rashida, but when you talk at these conferences and conventions, the people there want to be there. And the trick is to talk to the communities, and you'll still get situations, big ones, where the communities just don't accept it as a problem, or they'll say it's dealt with now. Thank you very much. The last 10 years have done a great job. We don't have it anymore, and that's clearly an issue for us. This issue of complacency, which will set in because you've got all the armory to tackle it.
I mean, the other thing is. Oh, sorry, Marie, go on.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree. In terms of Naz, the other thing that I've got, that I got from yesterday and throughout is this, it doesn't happen. You're right. There's a lot of that. It doesn't happen. Or it happens to somebody else. It's not mainstream. It's an other type of crime. Well, it isn't. It's all our business. And the problem is getting that message across. To say, you might see a patient in a hospital, in a doctor's surgery, in a toddler's group, wherever you are, and you need to be able to recognise that and be able to put those services in place. There's no point in having a law. There's no point in having statutory guidance if we don't use it.
Thank you all so much. That was incredibly valuable to us here at Tahere, and the others on the line have been saying that it's been a really great webinar and very informative, particularly to those of us deeply invested in thinking critically about what kind of response we want here in the United States. And so we're deeply grateful for your frankness and your honesty and all of your expertise that you shared with us today. I can open it up for closing comments from all three of you, and then I think we will go ahead and wrap the webinar there.
I'd just like to say thank you again, Thierry, for inviting me and allowing me to participate. I mean, I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I always enjoy engaging with these two, but I always learn. So it's given me some thoughts to take away for the weekend.
And same with me. I'm grateful to you for the opportunity to talk about the subject. It's not something, because of my other responsibilities, it's not something I talk about very frequently anymore, and that's a shame. But certainly we hope that we can assist in some way as we go forward.
And likewise for me, thank you very much for inviting me. And as always, I echo my colleagues' views that, you know, in any way we can assist, we're happy to.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so very much. I'm just going to advance the slides briefly so that everyone can see our contact information at the Tahereh Justice Center. And you're welcome to get in touch with us at any time with questions about this webinar or cases involving forced marriage victims or survivors here in the U.S. or abroad. And we are always happy to advise. And you also will find links on the website to other webinars that we have done. We will post this recorded webinar as soon as we can, and tons of other resources on preventforcedmarriage.org. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and thank you again to our panelists. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.